next presentation will be by Professor Andy Long. Professor Long has his law degree from William J. University College of Law, and he also has an LLM from New York University School of Law. Now, Professor Long is going to be giving us the international law perspective. Professor Long is actually a professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law, and there his research focuses on environmental governance, with an emphasis on developing legal responses to complex global environmental changes. He is particularly interested in the emergence of government theories and practices that account for the interconnection of environmental issues with human quality of life at multiple scales. Over the last few years, Professor Long has presented his research at the law schools of Yale, Georgetown, and other leading universities in the United States, including the University of Missouri School of Law today, and Europe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andy Long.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and all the students involved and others. This is a fantastic conference so far, and I'm really looking forward to some of the later speakers as well. Professor Benson kept using the phrase crisis narrative, so I have to tell you my crisis narrative from today, which is that when I woke up this morning, the changes I had made in this presentation yesterday effectively wiped almost the whole thing out. So I just put it back together, and when parts of it are not making sense, please feel free to raise your hand. I may have left out a link in the chain. Ask questions. I'll be happy to address them as I go. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today is essentially using the framework that Professor Arnold developed in his article about fourth generation environmental law, and also in his talk today. Are those forces happening at the international or global level as well, right? Because a lot of the examples that we heard from Professor Arnold are national, and to some extent, you know, they may be dependent upon or reflect the dynamics of having a government authority that can control the actions of the relevant actors, whereas in the international system, of course, we depend on state consent. So perhaps it's different. But many of the problems are the same. So are these forces that Professor Arnold pointed to happening in international environmental law? Are they happening in global environmental law, which is really something different and has more to do with the relationship between domestic and international, and the relationship of different domestic systems to each other? Or are they happening in some other ways in global environmental governments, or environmental governments above the state level? So maybe not so much law strictly, but other ways that we might affect behavior or norms related to the environment. Another way of saying this, I think, to ask the same question is, are the global environmental challenges that we're seeing and understanding much better now than we did certainly 50 years ago, but even 20 years ago, driving a legal evolution at the global level? Okay. Just to highlight a couple of things that may not come out particularly when we're talking about domestic law, the problems that we're talking about, climate change, biodiversity loss, a number of scientists are framing these in terms that are really severe and emphasize the scale. So this idea of the Anthropocene that you may have heard in some places, and I should point out it's not an official geologic term, though there is some discussion of that. But it symbolizes the idea that humanity has become essentially a force of nature, one of the sort of great forces shaping the planet. And the idea is that we have really left the Holocene, which gave us a stable climate, for example, for at least the last 10,000 years since humanity started agriculture. And so we are moving into this no analog state, right, where because of human impact, we've taken it beyond what all of human history has known into something different. And it affects what's often called the Earth system. I have some problems with framing this in terms of Earth system, but for this purpose I think it's helpful, right? So we have this large forces that are planet-wide and involve really long scales of time. So as we see changes in the climate, as we see biodiversity loss, these things are, from a human perspective, essentially irreversible. Okay, just quick, to give an example, biodiversity. This is, actually should be biodiversity loss, I apologize. This shows the rate of extinction over the last 600 million years. Those spikes are the mass extinctions. The most recent one here is what killed the dinosaurs. Right? Current rates of extinction, according to most biologists, are at the level of a mass extinction, whereas for most of these, there's some speculation that at least several of them were caused by extraterrestrial impacts, like a meteorite hitting the Earth. The current level of biodiversity loss is driven by human activity. Right, so that's an example of humans as essentially a force of nature. The average time for recovery of diversity after a mass extinction event has been approximately 5 to 10 million years. So we are not going to be able to recover these losses in any human time scale. E.O. Wilson described it actually in the early 1980s as the folly our descendants are least likely to forgive us for. Climate change wasn't quite as big of an issue there, but I think there's still a case that biodiversity is the one that will be hardest to sort of make up for, adapt to. Part of the reason is the way that it relates to ecosystem services. In the description that Arsenio read and talked about, it mentioned that I'm interested in how environmental problems relate with human well-being. That is very often why we are interested in these, right? And particularly in developing countries where people are much closer to, much more sensitive to fluctuations in environmental systems. They don't have as much room to absorb shocks, right? Preserving ecosystem services is a lot of why people become interested in biodiversity and a big part of where it impacts humanity. Drivers of biodiversity loss, and again, biodiversity is just to illustrate the types of problems. They're usually talked about in terms of HIPPO, which is habitat loss, invasive species, population, meaning human overpopulation, pollution, and overharvesting, and of course we need to add climate change. These drivers are intermixed, overlapping, really difficult to deal with in any way that we can imagine an international law in terms of, say, a treaty pronouncement, being able to specify how we're going to deal with habitat destruction throughout the world, right? Biodiversity is not evenly distributed, and we'll come back to this in just a minute. But this slide is just one example. There's many different ways that we could represent this, but it shows the number of species of vascular plants, and essentially the darker red, pink colors. Oh, they're not coming out that way here, are they? These regions are the most diverse. And so you can see, this is one other way to portray it. These dots are the hot spots. But biodiversity is concentrated in tropical developing countries. And yet, the benefits of biodiversity are both global and localized. So the political issue that comes up if we talk about biodiversity in the international context is essentially who should pay to preserve it. Developing countries will raise arguments based on history because it is primarily developed country activity that has created climate change up to this point, that has driven most of the biodiversity loss up to about the 1950s, particularly during times of colonialization. And then there are moral arguments very often based on differences in resources in terms of who should pay to preserve biodiversity or tropical forests. They're located in developing countries, and yet the arguments raised by developing countries very often try to shift the authority to developed countries. Here's an example that kind of illustrates what their argument is. So this is Borneo, 1950s to today, forest cover, right? And if we're concerned with the loss of forest cover, we might be looking for ways to, one approach would be to look for ways to restrict the ability to cut down virgin forests. Of course, if you take the United States from the 17th century to today, you see essentially the loss of forest cover that occurred. So, go into this later. So it's the same thing that already happened in developed countries, sort of use of resources to create wealth and putting off pollution is now happening in developing countries at a much greater scale. Okay. Recognition of global environmental problems occurred primarily beginning in the 1970s in sort of the early post-colonial era, from 1950s to 1980s or so, and really emerged on the international scene along with a rising voice from developing countries. So this tension between whether developed countries should be pushing a global environmental agenda, whether that's sort of eco-imperialist, whether they have an obligation to pay for developing country efforts to reduce global environmental problems, all kind of emerge at the same time. I have never put the development of international law in terms of generations before. I've seen it done to some extent, but it really does happen in waves, and I think generations is as good as any way to express this. So, in international environmental law, the first generation would really be, and this is mostly so I can get to the fourth generation, would really be interjurisdictional conflicts, very different than the global environmental problems. Things like too many countries hunting seals, or the trail smelter case, which was a pollution conflict, right? And this was bilateral, regional treaties to deal with this, and maybe some ad hoc dispute resolution. What we might think of more broadly as international environmental law, if you take a course on international environmental law, really started in the early 1970s with the Stockholm Declaration as a symbol of the beginning of international environmental laws we have it today. The multilateral environmental agreements began around this time, and I think until very recently they have been understood as the way to address large-scale problems, global environmental problems, and also large-scale interjurisdictional disputes. Multilateral environmental agreements are like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Convention on Biological Diversity, right? They almost universally have a conference of the parties that meets every year or every other year to negotiate policy adjustments under the treaty. We'll talk about them more in just a minute. The other thing that we see from 1972 until about 1987, which is the Montreal Protocol, or 1992, which is the Rio Earth Summit, an emphasis on sovereignty. If you look at the Stockholm Declaration or the early multilateral environmental agreements, they point to the national level as sort of the place where authority is situated. So CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, uses national level authorities' control over imports and exports to try to regulate trade in endangered species. Right? And that's a good example of what we would see from this generation of international environmental law. What we could call the third generation then would be what began primarily with the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which I think by almost all accounts is the most successful international environmental agreement ever signed, and probably likely will be the most successful ever, because a lot of it had to do with the specific nature of the problem, but it was very influential in the way that we thought about dealing with global environmental problems. Ozone is an atmospheric problem, so although we had a hole over Antarctica, we could think of it in global terms because it's atmospheric, because the ozone depleting substances could come from a number of different places. And I think the success of the Montreal Protocol, and at least the superficial similarity between ozone and climate change, may be part of why we adopted that similar structure for the climate change agreement a few years later. Also, the end of the Cold War was important for this period, and the 1992 Rio Earth Summit UN conference on the environment and development was a really hopeful event. If you look at videos from that time, read speeches of those times, there was a real sense that we have a chance now, there's a real possibility of addressing these large-scale problems: climate change, biodiversity loss, tropical deforestation. And I think if we look back, the approaches that were adopted fit very well with this concept of unimodal and fragmented. They engaged complex and fully grown problems, but without a whole lot of sensitivity perhaps to the context. So the climate change regime takes a framework and protocol approach that was based more or less on the Montreal Protocol. It focuses on emissions limitations, very much in the same way that the Montreal Protocol focused on emissions limitations. There was a framework and protocol approach taken for biodiversity. There's no good metric like emissions limitations for biodiversity loss. So if you look through the Convention on Biological Diversity, it's very hard to figure out if anybody's actually required to do anything, except maybe occasionally file a report. This period, from about 1987 to about 2009, 2010, involved a lot of international environmental lawmaking. Sort of much more attention to the area, a number of treaties signed, but also a lot of significant decisions under the conferences of the parties. The treaties at this time are also almost universally, maybe with the exception of the Desertification Convention, top-down structures. And this, I think, is based on the international law concept of sovereignty and the requirement for consent. So they would develop sort of a least common denominator, and as the basic requirements, say the emissions limitations in the Kyoto Protocol, right? And hope to adjust them through either further protocols or through conferences of the parties, but it was always imposed from the international level down onto the states. Okay, I've walked through some of this already, but just to illustrate that essentially similar approaches were used for very different problems. Fragmentation, I think, is also a significant problem, and I use just biodiversity here as another example. So if we move from international law, right here, one subsegment of that is international environmental law. Within that we have biodiversity, and I just listed a couple of others just to illustrate. Within biodiversity, we have the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, Convention on Migratory Species, Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species, and World Heritage Convention. And actually, of the issue areas, the biodiversity conventions are probably the most well coordinated. But you can see how there's sort of a rapid expansion of institutional structures to deal with these problems. And some unification in terms of approach, but not a whole lot of coordination in implementation, certainly not across issue areas, say from biodiversity to climate change. Okay, so that's most of what is taught if we teach a course in international environmental law, right? It's that period of international environmental law. So is that period over? I would suggest that it is, and that really the pivotal event was the conference in Copenhagen, the 15th conference of the parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think that signaled the end of Rio's dream, the sense that we could all come together and agree to impose requirements on nations that would solve global environmental problems. It's not going to happen, and it is pretty widely acknowledged now in a way that it wasn't in 2008. So I think that was a real turning point. The complexity and interrelationship of global environmental problems, it's become increasingly clear. So biodiversity, for example, we have set targets several times. Millennium Development Goals set targets on biodiversity. There were other targets for 2010. If you look at World Biodiversity Outlook 3, which came out a few years ago, out of a large number, maybe 20 to 50 targets for biodiversity, 2 of them were met, or 2 of them showed progress. One was designation of land for protected areas. The other was funding. None of them had anything to do with measures of actual biodiversity protection. Those were all negative. So it's becoming clear that the approach didn't work. We have increasing evidence on the relationship between climate change and biodiversity, for example, the effects of climate change on oceans, sort of feedback loops, synergies. And we also see more clearly some of the legal or institutional problems of this third generation approach. For example, sovereignty has been a major limitation on using the top-down approach in international law. Especially the United States, but also some of the developing countries have been highly resistant to give over any significant authority. So there might be a good argument that if the problem is global, we should regulate it at the global level. But so long as we have liberal constitutional democracies, we don't have a supranational power that can impose that. The United States, if you take a look at the debate in the Senate on ratifying the Convention on Biological Diversity, there were a number of senators who were expressly concerned that ratifying the Convention on Biological Diversity would give the Conference of the Parties the authority to set law for the United States. The tension between developing and developed countries that I mentioned at the outset became, I think, in some ways more intense during the third generation of international environmental law. Good symbols of that would be the failure to agree on a forest convention in 1992. But the basic problem was developing countries were not going to restrict their use of tropical forests unless they were being compensated for it. And developed countries were not going to compensate them. 2001, President Bush rejected the Kyoto Protocol, essentially on the basis that China and other developing countries would not have any restrictions, and so it would be economically disadvantageous to the United States to agree to this approach. I mentioned biodiversity, but a range of issues. If you look at measures of actual progress on the ground in dealing with these issues, there has been very little, in some ways, since 1992. Better understanding, a lot of institutions, not a whole lot of change in the indicators. So what is the fourth generation of international environmental law? Does it have the same sort of forces that Professor Arnold has identified in the United States? I think there are some signs that it does. One development that's I pointed to it in a couple of articles, and several other people have as well. The REDD+ mechanism under the climate change regime may be an indication of sort of where we're going with international environmental law. It was originally proposed as a way to compensate developing countries for preserving forests, and the compensation would be based on the carbon in the forest. Deforestation amounts to about 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's relatively cheap, right, to preserve the forest from a developed country's perspective. It is certainly cheaper to pay developing countries more than the opportunity cost of cutting down the forest than to retrofit the equivalent number of coal-fired power plants in the United States. Right? So that's where the idea came from. And I'll talk about it more in just a couple minutes. Another development that I think sort of signals where we're going is the growth in conversations about polycentric governance and similar theories, looking for alternatives to the top-down model of international environmental law. So rather than have the nations get together and create an authority and put a number on it that they then impose on the states, what other arrangements are possible? How can we sort of share authority between the levels, reinforce what's happening at various levels? There is some move towards integration. The Convention on Biological Diversity in particular has taken a number of steps to reach across institutional lines with the climate change, with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It also sort of convenes meetings of the Biodiversity Conventions, the whole list of them that I saw there, to try to coordinate the approach, to try to make sure that sort of break down the walls of siloing and begin to think in sort of multi-issue ways. Is there a move towards multimodality? Well, I think the main thing that the Copenhagen Conference stands for is a recognition that there are no panaceas. We can't just hope really hard and deal with climate change. So we need to find different approaches, and I think a lot of what we see both in the literature and in the sorts of discussions that are happening in international institutions is an attempt to confront complexity and uncertainty. We don't have answers, but we are at least confronting these issues. I think some of the limitations on what we can do at the international level, even as we try to move into a fourth generation, are pretty familiar. State consent, the requirement of states' consent to be bound is a sort of massive limitation. Enforces a lowest common denominator if we try to set a global standard. So we have to find ways to work around that, right? Treaty or change it, that doesn't seem very likely. Treaty law is not going to get beyond the least common denominator. In any with a very rare case, like the Montreal Protocol, which was economically advantageous to a number of different countries to agree to. So it may be more about setting up structures that can expand differently in different places. Finance and the push for development in developing countries, I think are also limits, but can be turned into opportunities. The Red Plus mechanism that I talked about happens in developing countries, happens primarily with money from developed countries, and it has the opportunity to build in a number of different issues. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit more quickly since I know that I'm just about out of time. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is many of the drivers of global environmental problems were historically attributable to developed countries, but now that's changing. So China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, right? As developing countries want to develop, they're having much greater impact on global environmental forces. And there's a lot more people in China, in India. If they all start to have an American lifestyle, right, that if we have not done something to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, we get every person in China a car, right? That's incredibly problematic. So I think as that shift is happening, the developed world really needs to think about ways that we can incentivize cleaner growth. We can make an argument that there is, I think we can make a very good argument that there's a moral obligation for developed countries to assist with cleaner growth. And something like the Red Plus mechanism has that as part of its purpose. So how do we do that more effectively? And I've talked about this, but again, other people are talking about it as well. One way to think about it is that where we have multiple overlapping issues, if we're going to be giving money to something like preserving a forest, if we focus only on the carbon, right, there's a risk of excluding the people who lived in the forest. There's a risk of cutting down native forests that are full species and planting quick-growing trees that hold a lot of carbon. And some of the early forest carbon projects did both of those things. But if we pay attention to multiple issues, and I like to talk about these three as sort of broadly representing environmental issues, but if we look at climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being in a particular context, right, and we can frame international institutions aid to developing countries or developed countries supportive projects, right, and assess them on all three of those, then we start to create sort of new ways of doing things that will be sustainable on the ground and also resilient, but sustainable in the sense that they will go on for a long time. For example, Red Plus projects can create new types of livelihoods for people who had traditionally relied on poaching or illegal logging. They can build in sustainable agriculture in a way that still preserves the forest. Another good example of somewhere that you could have these, three types of issues met. Several parts of Africa there's rampant deforestation for fuel wood. And then when you burn that fuel wood in the home, it creates intense indoor air pollution with a very high death rate of children from asthma. Really quite cheap cook stoves and creating some sort of other supply, localized supply of energy can offset that problem, meet both of those. Reduce the deforestation, reduce the indoor air pollution. And this is just, okay, so the Red Plus mechanism grew within the climate change regime. To some extent, we have to work with the institutions that we have. We do have a lot of institutional structures at the international level to deal with environmental problems. There are problems with those institutions, but there are also some ways we can use them. If we think of the RED mechanism as something that we want to make more holistic, right, it does support the goals of the climate change regime, and it could be framed as such. There's a mitigation value in terms of saving carbon. There's an adaptation value in terms of shoring up ecosystems and vulnerable populations against climate change impacts. And the results meet the overall goals of the climate change regime, even though a lot of what we're talking about is biodiversity, ecosystem services, different types of forestry, creating agriculture. So the institutions may be siloed, but their projects don't necessarily have to be. How am I doing on time?
Pretty much out.
Okay.
But it looks like.
So these were just to suggest that we can do this in several other ways, and I'll wrap up in about 1 to 2 minutes. So moving forward from what we have known as international environmental law, I think really involves rethinking the role of law. And it may have to do with thinking more in terms of governance and authority. The concepts such as adaptive law or global law, I think, are very important to this process. I think it was Professor Benson who said the way that we think about these things really matters, the way we frame these issues really matters. It matters here too. International environmental law was all about top-down. Global law is about learning across jurisdictions. It's about developing approaches in one place that might have application somewhere else, right? Sharing information, sharing experiences, sharing technology in many cases. So one last thing that I'll point to. Professor Arnold pointed to energy as a very, very difficult problem. I'm going to post probably tomorrow on SSRN a paper that suggests we should think about climate change as a problem that emerges from the global energy system, rather than as an environmental problem. It is an emergent property of an energy system, right? And I think if we start to think in terms like that, we can do a lot better than the UNFCCC. Questions or?
Thank you. Do we have any questions? We have some questions. Take one or two for speed a little bit.
Okay.
Questions? Yes.
Just a question, when you're talking about sort of different systems and structures and networks and so forth, it strikes me with the agriculture, sort of think about agriculture and the environment on a sort of more global scale, that we're talking about, a largely sort of private sector or corporate food supply and distribution economy, really. And so, you have any thoughts on that? I mean, sometimes law and governance sort of sounds like, the public sector, right? And any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the first thought, that is a big part, I think, of where fourth generation international environmental law needs to go, if that's what we're calling it. Because one of the other major changes that we see is an increase in the influence of non-state actors, right? I think creation of market incentives might be a way to start to address that, and governments can have a role in that, international institutions, right? To the extent that it's not happening from the private sector, there may be ways to adjust some of the incentives to get at them. But I think creating multi-issue programs in specific places can be attractive to private actors as well, because it can be more stable, more predictable for them, right? But, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.